Hello, everyone, and welcome back. It's been a little week. I'm here in Montreal, Canada, to prepare for the North American Polyglot Symposium. And because of the travel and some unfortunate incidents where I lost some of the recordings that I'd done, unfortunately, I wasn't able to get an episode out last week. But I'm back here, and we're going to be taking you back to the basics with a very sort of basic language learning episode. It's with Agnieszka from 5 Minute Language, and we're going to be talking about general language learning tips and tricks. So if you're new to language learning or you just want to reinforce the fundamentals and listen to Agnieszka's wisdom, then this episode is perfect for you. And I hope to see as many of you as possible in Montreal, of course. And if not, I hope you check out the recordings from the event. I'm sure it's going to be great. So I hope you're all doing well and enjoyed this week's episode with Agnieszka. All right, we're back with another episode of the Actual Fluency podcast, and today I'm joined by Agnieszka Murdoch, and she's a language coach and a founder of the 5 Minute Language, a blog and community for those who want to learn languages effectively, even if they're busy. So, Agnieszka, how's it going?
Hi, Chris. Thank you very much for having me on the podcast. It's a real pleasure to be here and talk to you.
It's a pleasure to have you. And before we get into all this 5 minute language and language coaching, then why don't you give people an introduction on how you get into language learning and got to the point you are today?
Okay. So I was born in Poland. Polish is my native language, and the story of me learning languages is actually quite I don't know, you might think it's boring. I think it's quite interesting because I guess I almost stopped learning languages before I even started. So when I was about 13 years old, my parents sent me to English lessons. And I didn't really quite understand why they were doing this. Obviously, I was learning English at school, and I was, one of the first generations of students in Poland who had a chance to actually learn English. Because, as many of you will know, Poland used to be a kind of a very different country before 1989,
Right.
before the fall of the Berlin Wall. So before that time, when my parents went to school, the only language you could learn was Russian, because of the kind of the relationship between the Soviet Union and Poland, obviously. So my parents clearly saw that there was an opportunity there in learning languages when it became possible to learn languages other than Russian, because obviously Europe was changing and the world was changing, and Poland became more open to the West and the countries that spoke English and German and French and other languages. So they sent me to English lessons, and I didn't really understand why. So I refused to go. And it took them a lot of effort and a lot of time to actually convince me that this was something that would be beneficial at some point in my life. Um, so I did eventually continue with the English, and I'm really grateful for that now, because that pretty much opened up a lot of opportunities for me. I started learning French when I was at secondary school. In Poland, like in many European countries, you have to actually study two foreign languages at school. I don't know what it's like in Denmark.
Mm-hmm.
Is
The
it the
same.
same?
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, and yeah, so I did English and French, and I was not very good at science. My family is quite scientific. They've got quite scientific brains and ways of thinking, and a slightly different kind of background than me, more kind of technical and scientific. So I was a bit of an odd one out. But languages was something that I was really interested in and good at. So I did that at school, and then I ended up going to England to do my university degree. And that's where I did French, and I ended up going on a year abroad to France, and that's when I really experienced the kind of idea of being able to communicate in another language. I mean, obviously, I could do that in England as well, but French was the kind of first foreign language that I started from scratch.
Hmm.
Um, because, with English, I used to watch sort of Cartoon Network cartoons and know a little bit of English when I was a child. But with French, it was the first time that I really had a chance to learn it from scratch. So that was
Mm.
really exciting. And then I basically took up other languages in the last sort of 10 years, I suppose. So I've learned Spanish and German. I've been working on my German constantly over the last 10 years, on and off. And I've recently been learning Japanese. That's my new kind of adventure, which I started before I went to Japan for the first time a couple of months ago. So that was just a thing that I did as a way to basically learn something new about a language that was completely different to any other language I'd ever attempted learning.
Right.
So that's it.
That's nice. I like the idea that you were resistant towards languages. Obviously, inadvertently so, but I remember my own childhood that anything in a school subject, even though I sort of secretly enjoyed it, was still a school subject.
Yeah, yeah.
So even if I really enjoyed German, when I was about, I don't know, 10 maybe, it was still school, and we were too cool for school at that time. So we'd much rather be in the yard playing football or playing
Yeah.
with Pokemon cards or whatever we were doing back then. But it's funny how we don't, well, kids in general don't know what's good for them, and languages is just such a huge thing that if you start off on the wrong foot, I mean, you must really be happy about your parents, because it's so easy for you just to give up on languages from the beginning and never really get into it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think, when you start early, when you start at the stage, I mean, obviously, I seriously started learning when I was about 13, but before that, I actually, when I was a child, I remember sort of playing with my brother, my younger brother, and pretending that I was speaking foreign languages. I don't know how old I was, maybe, I don't know, 8 or 10. Uh, and uh, and yeah, and I was pretending that I was speaking another language, and he actually probably believed that I was speaking another language, which was quite a funny thing. And then I would translate that language into Polish to let him know what I just said. So I think I always had this kind of part of a kind of being a linguist was probably always part of me, but when I was 13, I was probably at the stage that you just mentioned, which was, I'm too cool for this and I
Yeah,
want to be doing other things. But actually, when you start early, that's when you still think it's fun, and it's a way to kind of discover a new reality.
yeah,
Learning new language, knowing that, there are other people out there, and learning about their ways of expressing um, reality, really describing reality. So it's a great way to get a child interested, I think, in languages.
yeah. And if you start early, then that becomes their new life. For instance, a lot of people ask me how I learned English, and the truth is, I
Mm,
have no idea because I just did. It's like I wasn't living
yeah,
in an English-speaking country, but studying English in grade 2 or something, maybe even, and maybe it was 4. I remember when I left school, they changed it to 2, but school seemed almost pointless because I was just playing video games or watching.
mm,
We don't have dubbing in Denmark, so if you just
yeah,
watch a lot of Friends or whatever was on at the time, you just pick up English, and it's just completely effortless, and it's just a part of my life from back then. But if I had to choose at age, let's say around the early teens, then maybe I would have opted out due to it
yeah,
being too cool for school or
yeah,
whatever. So
absolutely.
yeah, it's an interesting topic that, and teaching kids languages is a topic that I find really interesting, and you can really give
Yeah,
these these new humans a complete leg up in such an early part of their life opens so many doors and
Yeah. And I think it's interesting that you said that you don't really know how you learned English. And I think there's something about learning a language as an adult that makes us incapable, because we are adults, we kind of make ourselves incapable of learning a language because we are aware that we are learning a language. And, some people have spoken about this before, that you have to learn like a child. And there's something about it. Obviously, we have expectations of ourselves. We have goals, and we're very conscious of the learning process. And if it's not going right, if it's not going according to how we want it to go, then we notice it and we become self-conscious, and we give up hope.
right.
And I think children don't have this. I'm not really an expert in teaching children necessarily, but it seems to me that children don't have the same level of
Yeah.
self-awareness as adults do, and that's why they're probably better at trying and speaking a language of it, even if they can't really speak it properly, but really having a go, and that's what gives them an advantage.
Yeah, they just speak out loud. They have no concept of shame. They have no
Yeah,
inhibitions. They have no. They actually they don't have as much as of a filter as adults do, because the adult brain realizes that you can't absorb everything. There's no room for every single stimulus that you see or hear or is presented with. So the brain is doing a lot of filtering. And I think as a
yeah,
kid, you filter way less because everything is just like, oh, look at that, look at that, look at that. But when you become an adult, you're like, oh yeah, that's a bottle, that's a, that's a bowl, that's a whatever. And
yeah,
so the brain just kind of ignores it. And I think there is something to it. Of course, I think that's a fact that children do learn languages easier and more effortlessly. But I don't like the idea that some people use it as an excuse to say that adults cannot learn languages.
oh, I totally agree with you on that.
That's just not that. That's like saying I can't run because some guy can run a marathon in 2 hours. It's like just because
Yeah,
he's way better doesn't mean you don't get the benefits for doing it slower. Or yeah, I guess that's a pretty good metaphor. It's the same speed or time. You might, and if it takes me 6 hours to run a marathon, I don't know, probably take longer to be honest. But I'd arrive at the same point if you call that fluency or whatever, B1 or a C1, whatever you call it. Just
yeah,
because I'm slower, I'll still get there at some point. It's not impossible. Although I do believe some people think that way, which is a little bit
yeah,
concerning.
yeah. I think a lot of people do, and I think the other kind of, just going back to the kind of children versus adult comparison, I think it's interesting that adults have very specific expectations of what they want to say and what they want to learn, and they want to learn a lot of vocabulary. They want to be able to say everything they want to be able to translate
Oh
word for
yeah,
word. Whereas children probably learn what's useful and what actually allows them to get by, because communication for them maybe is more natural
yeah,
than for adults. And if something works, then it works. Whereas for an adult, often if it works, it's not enough because you have to be perfect.
yeah,
So I think that's true. But I think I absolutely agree with you that it doesn't matter how old you are. It just, what matters is how much you want it, and whether you're doing what you should be doing to get there.
yeah. Which we can get into in just a minute. I feel like that'll probably be part of one of the other topics that we'll get into. But yeah,
Yeah.
I really enjoy talking about these kind of how we can make language learning more, I guess, accessible in a way, because you have to believe it before you can do
Mm.
it. And I really believe that what all the language learning bloggers, all the YouTubers, and even podcasters like myself, we're trying to, in a way, spreading a message that yeah, you can do it, and it's not that difficult actually. Which I guess is a
Mm.
good segue into the 5 minute language, because uh, that's a new project of yours. Do you want to talk about it? How you got started with it and your idea for it?
Yeah. So 5 minute language, maybe it's a bit of an unfortunate name. Maybe not. I don't actually believe that you can learn a language in 5 minutes.
Oh,
Uh, let's just put it out there. So the idea is that it actually started as a blog I wanted to write about Polish, and it used to be called 5 Minute Polish. And then I kind of branched out and I thought, actually, you know what? I am passionate about other languages. I am Polish, it's my native language. I'm also passionate about sharing my knowledge of Polish with other people, but actually, I want to be able to reach people who learn, any language
sure.
out there. So it evolved from there. But the idea is that essentially, as an adult, as a busy person, or as as a student, even, everyone's got different commitments, and I don't think any commitment outside of learning languages should be an excuse to not learn a
Hmm.
language. And I think there are a lot of people out there who are interested in the idea of learning languages by themselves, but they don't quite know how to do it. Maybe they've had bad experiences in the past of going to language lessons, or buying resources that didn't really work for them.
Hmm.
And so they might have this idea that, oh, I can't really do this without any formal education. But I think what my blog is trying to communicate is that you can actually fit language learning around your lifestyle, even if if you've got a full-time job, if you're in full-time education. There are things in your life that you do outside of those commitments that you can use to learn a language effectively.
Mm.
So if you read the news every day, why don't you do it in the language that you're learning? If you listen to podcasts about things that are unrelated to language learning, why don't you find a podcast? If you're interested in business, why don't you find a podcast in Japanese and listen to that?
Hmm.
And it's all these little things. It's this idea of marginal gains that a lot of people talk about. So I know it's quite a common idea in cycling, where if you go to the Olympics as a cyclist, everyone else is as good as you. You're the best people in the world, and there's a handful of you. And how different is your level going to be from somebody else's? It's
Hmm.
going to be pretty much the same. So how do you win?
Right.
You have to make marginal gains. You have to try a little bit harder, and it's a question of cycling to a 2 second difference, or 5 second or
Yeah.
1 second difference between you and another person, and that's the difference between silver and gold. And I think all these little things, all these tiny little victories come together, and they make you good at whatever it is that you're trying to do. And I
Right.
think with language learning, that's the idea that I'm trying to communicate, that you have to take it step by step. So 5 minutes at a time, and one day you'll get there.
Right. There are a lot of things in what you just said I wanted to talk a little bit about. But firstly, the name. Before we started this recording, I was thinking about the name, and I said, hmm. On one hand, I really like it, but there are also, of course, parts of it I don't like because it might give false expectations I should just clear it up. But I really like the name because my philosophy is that 5 minutes a day in any language, as long as it's a focused form of studying, probably usually using some kind of guide, some kind of book maybe that has some kind of, structure. I mean, I don't think you learn a language, for instance, by doing 5 minutes of flashcards a day, because then you'll just kind of you'll have the
Yeah,
pieces of the puzzle, but you don't kind of see the whole picture. You don't see how to actually use the pieces. So if
yeah,
you use something like, let's say, colloquial, teach yourself, one of these courses, so to speak, 5 minutes a day, I'm pretty sure you can get very far in at least, let's say, similar languages to begin with, something like French for English speakers, Spanish for French speakers, Italian for Spanish speakers, whatever.
yeah,
But the thing is that it's really difficult actually to take 5 minutes. out of your day, and then well, it's not difficult in a technical practical term. It's more difficult mentally to kind of
Mm.
switch what you're doing and do that. The benefit, if you do manage to get the habit of doing 5 minutes, is that you'll often find that you don't do 5 minutes. You'll more often be doing more longer sessions because you're like, oh, I've got the book open anyway. Or it's like, when I go, I did Duolingo a little bit earlier, and I just wanted to do one of those sessions. I don't know what they're called, lessons maybe. And after I'd done it, I saw that I was only missing one lesson to finish the whole checkpoint. I was like,
Mm.
okay, I'll do this one too. So in essence, I just doubled my output, but I didn't go into it saying, oh, I'll do two lessons because then I'll probably not do any. So
Yeah, yeah.
I really like that philosophy of baby steps, but there's nothing if you set in your phone or diary or calendar, whatever you use, I'll do 5 minutes of French today. There's nothing stopping you from sitting down and then realizing, you know what, this is kind of nice. I'll do half an hour, whatever. But
Y-
it's really hard to to put down half an hour and then get the motivation or energy to actually do it because it feels like such a task.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think it reminds me, have you ever heard of this flossing metaphor? Some people say
Oh yeah. It's
if you don't,
Amit Sethi, isn't it?
is it?
I think he's the one I heard it from.
Yeah,
He might have
uh,
been some other guy who came up with
probably,
it.
yeah. If you don't floss, just floss one tooth, and
Yeah.
then you will actually end up flossing.
Yeah, start with one tooth, and
Yeah,
some days you'll only do that one tooth, and that's totally fine. But eventually, you're just gonna build up, and you're just gonna ride your own success to a full set of, oh, I don't know how many teeth we have. That's a lacking.
it depends on
Oh
the
yeah, that's
person.
true. That's true. Yeah, that's true. Around I don't know, some number that I don't know, but
Yeah.
so I really like that concept, and that's also what I constantly talk to people about when I introduce myself, and people say, "So what do you do?" and stuff like that, and I say, "Oh well, I do this a day, but then in my spare time I like to learn languages." And they're like, "Oh, do
Mm.
you? I always wanted to learn French," and I was like, "Why don't you just do it?" And they're like, "Well." And then I list off all the excuses, But the most common excuse I hear is, I don't have time.
Mm.
And I find that such a blatant lie that I almost want to call people out on it because there is no way. I mean, unless you think that it requires 5 hours of serious study a day,
Mm.
or that you don't believe you could do it yourself, that might also be a problem if people think they have to go to some night school or school in general. But anyway,
Yeah.
everyone has time. If you feel like you don't have time to learn a language, it's not a time problem, it's a priority problem.
Yeah.
Uh, it's it's just like, okay, if you watch any amount of TV in a week, you have time to learn a language. If
Yeah.
you can get out 5 minutes before, you can go to bed 5 minutes later, you can do it in your break, you can do it in your commute. I mean, it's just a lie basically, and it kind of annoys me. But at the same time, I realize that I only think like this because I've been endlessly brainwashed by people like myself to think like that. When I started the
Yeah.
podcast 2 years ago, I'm sure I did believe that some people were just too busy to learn a language. But now I totally don't believe that. And, you have to start
Yeah.
with one. And I think a lot of people I meet who aren't into sort of polyglotism or whatever you want to call
Mm.
the hobby itself, these people just don't want to learn one language. I want to learn French because I really like France, and my best friend's granddad is French or whatever. They
Yeah.
have these very specific motivations for one language. I find it very rare to talk to people who's saying, "Oh, I really wish I knew German, French, Spanish, Italian, and Japanese."
Mm.
Those people are only at the polyglot gathering and conferences and whatnot. But those people will know already. So my interest is actually more in the people who say, "Oh, I really want to learn French." Or whatever insert whatever language, and then questioning, why is that? Why are you not doing it? And it's
Yeah.
always a motivational issue. And I think with your philosophy of the 5 minute, let's say a day or whatever, 5 minutes here, 5 minutes there, people could really open their eyes to these micro progress steps towards
Yeah.
fluency.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting what you've said. I think it is, I think I partly agree it's a motivation question. But I think also what you said about not knowing why they're not doing it. So I think if somebody says to me, I'd like to learn French and I just don't know, I just don't think I can do it, then I would ask them, why do you why do you think you can't do it? And I think you need to kind of get to the bottom of the issue, really,
Mm.
as with anything. Um, but yeah, not having time is definitely not an excuse. And you said watching TV. Yeah, if you watch TV, then add up the time that you spend doing that. You know, how many times do you check Facebook every day?
Yeah.
And that it doesn't. Some people's counter argument to that could be that, oh, I check it 15 times a day, but it only takes 15 seconds each time. But really, what you're doing is you're using up your brain's capacity to do other stuff. So you're tired because your brain is constantly processing new information.
Hmm.
Whenever you scroll down your Facebook feed, that's what your brain is doing. You may not realize that, but actually, your brain is trying to identify and process information. And I'm sure you've heard about the idea of decision fatigue as well.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And that's something that we all suffer from. How many decisions do we have to take every day when we're on social media? Click this or click that,
Yeah.
or choose which article to read. And it all burns you out, really. And I think that's where you can save energy by minimizing. I'm saying this, it's a challenge for myself at the moment, so I'm trying to get better at it myself, trying to minimize the number of times I do certain things
Hmm.
so that I don't waste energy on that. And by doing that, I can create more energy for things like, creative, different kind of creative projects I do, writing blog posts, learning languages. Um, so, some people talk about, check your emails twice a day or
Hmm.
check your emails once a week if you can.
Yeah,
Uh,
I check my emails all the time, and it's not a good idea.
yeah, and how many times there's nothing new.
Most of
Most
the
of the
time.
time there's nothing new. So
Most of the time.
that's definitely a good point. And it also, what you said about Duolingo, it actually reminded me of something I read about Duolingo the other day. I think they did some research into the optimum amount of time that they want users to spend on it. I can't remember the exact number now, but they essentially said, don't binge on Duolingo,
Right.
because if you do that, you're going to burn out.
Yeah.
So I think it was something like maybe 30 minutes maximum.
Right.
I can't remember exactly, but that just shows that you don't actually need to be in a class for five hours to get better at a language. In fact, you're going to get worse because you're gonna lose your attention, you're gonna lose your motivation, and you're just gonna be burnt out.
Yeah, there's definitely a negative. There's an the what do you call it? The gains in language ability are definitely going down the more time you spend in one session. But you can spread out the sessions for sure. I mean, you can take a walk and come back.
Yeah,
If you want to be really ambitious, and some people definitely can and are, we're talking about motivational issues of just sitting down and doing something. Whereas I know people who can sit down for 8 hours and study without any problems. So it's funny that that difference exists as well. It's not a universal problem. But for me, it takes a lot of willpower to change or switch what I'm doing right now into what I want to do. Something like learning a language, or well, you can even compare it to exercising, cooking, shopping, chores, all
yeah,
these things. The, just because it takes 15 seconds to, let's say, go out, take the trash out, the mental shift that you do is really takes up a lot more energy. And you have to, once you've done the little micro task or whatever it is that you say you don't spend much time on, like checking Facebook, you kind of have to get back into real life as well. If you're writing a book and you decide, oh, I'm just going to check a YouTube video, you can't just jump right back into the book writing. You really need
Mm.
to reframe and refocus and probably take a walk or just a little break. And that's why I think that when people say, oh, I only use 15 seconds on Facebook, yeah, it might be 15 actual seconds, but your mind takes a lot longer to adapt. And also, it might be processing what you just read, as you just talked about. You get bumped with all these new ideas and stimulus. And let's be honest, funny cat pictures. And
Yeah.
so there's a
But
lot going on.
yeah, but that's also brain energy, If
Oh,
you
yeah.
want to learn effectively, you need to consider how that's affecting you.
Yeah.
Um,
It's
yeah.
it's tough, it's funny, and I talk about this a lot with in terms of productivity, because we want to do something, but it's like there's a disconnect between what we want to do and what we're actually doing. And
Yeah.
does that mean that we don't want it enough, or does that mean that we just don't know really how to productively do it? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's tough.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. And I think a lot of the time it is not knowing what it is that actually separates us from that goal.
You
And I
mean you
think,
don't know the steps involved in becoming better at language X, for instance?
yeah, and I think, especially if you're a language learner and you've never learned another language, you don't actually know what it takes. I went for my first 5K run last week, first time ever. And I just didn't know what to aim for. I had no idea how
Right.
long it takes to run 5 kilometers. Um, I just didn't know whether it's going to take 45 minutes or 20 minutes, what's a good time, what's a bad time. And it did seem a bit overwhelming, to be honest, because it was an organized run and they said 3 laps, and I just thought, how am I going to do that? So I think, with language learning, you don't know what to expect. That's one thing. You look at other people who are already good at that language, and you think, maybe they're talented, maybe they have some special skills that I don't have. And you don't realize that actually there are specific steps that those people took to actually get there. So I
Right.
think a lot of the time it's a question of, breaking down that big goal into small steps, and then finding the right tools to get through each of the steps. And I think, people like yourself, with your podcast, and the people that you interview and the people who write about language learning online, I think that's where they come in with their suggestions. And it's great that there's a community out there, of people who want to supply those people who feel slightly lost,
Yeah.
with information and advice. So that's
But
that's
of course,
great.
there's also lots of traps and dangers there, because, for instance, the first blog I found was Benny Lewis's blog, and I found his blog when he was, I believe, something like 8 years or 7 years into traveling the world learning languages. So by then,
Hmm.
he had already learned over 10 languages. And Benny's it's not a C1 learned language. It's just communication, whatever that
Yeah,
means.
yeah.
But still, to me, that was super impressive, and I was like, well, if Benny can do it, why can't I do it? And the the answer is quite obvious, because, like you mentioned, he's had 8 years of doing it. So of course he can do it so easily and effortlessly, because he's used to the process. His brain knows what to expect. He's got more languages to draw cognates from. He can derive grammar terms from other languages as well. And I see it
Hmm.
now, even just with, I have maybe three really solid languages and then three somewhat questionable languages. But I see,
Yeah.
I draw on my experience in the different languages all the time. For instance,
Mm.
there was a flashcard. One of my friends made a Hungarian flashcard deck on Memrise. And in one of the notes, it said, it was the word kell, which means like have to, but it's kind of, you can't just use it like I have to. You have to kind of say,
Hmm.
I guess it's the same in Polish, maybe. But anyway, I took it from Russian, and he wrote behaves like нужно. And I was like, oh, okay.
Mm.
So it's very easy, because I use my experience from another language. And,
Yeah,
and then
yeah.
times 10 with Betty. I know that many of the languages were related as well, But it's just completely ridiculous to believe that I, as a completely new independent language learner, can jump in and be as good as him as at acquiring a new language. It doesn't mean that it's impossible, but you really have to be careful with comparison. You can't just say, "Oh, well, if he can do it, I can do it as well." Of course, you can do it, but you won't do it in 3 months, probably.
Yeah, yeah, I think you're right. And I think the other, so that's one danger, comparing yourself. And I think at the same time, something that goes hand in hand with comparing yourself is not really fully appreciating what you've got to offer yourself, and not really fully appreciating the things that you've already learned, the things that you already know. And yeah, and I think when it comes to learning a language, it's a very kind of um, unique skill in that you can't really, I mean, at least that's my impression, that you can't really say, you know, I've done it.
Right. It's never over.
Whereas when you learn how to cycle, you can say it, I've done it, because you know how to do it now. It,
Yep.
it's several steps, and that's it. That's the end of the process. But with learning languages, it's just so stretched out. I'm learning my native language at the moment in
Yeah.
a way because I don't know all the ways to express myself in my native language yet. And I hope, I can continue to do that throughout my life. And because of that, because it's so stretched out, I think it's easy to get into the kind of mentality of, yes, I got through the past tense, so now I'm moving on to the future tense. And once I got that, I'm going to move on to vocabulary and I'm going to nail it and I'm going to move on to the next thing. And you never really have time to stop when you do that. So
Hmm.
I think it's very important when learning a language to actually stop every now and then and actually look back and think, you know what? There are people out there who are only just starting out, and I'm great because I've already done 3 months of Japanese and
Yeah.
I know how to introduce myself.
There you go.
Uh, so yes, I think that's another kind of, Benny Lewis was there too,
It's not also always
and he
easy.
talks about it all the time.
Yeah.
He was crap at languages when he started out, and look at him now. So yeah, I think it's definitely, I agree with you. It's definitely important to kind of remember
And
that
it's
there are different
tough.
stages. It's tough,
It's
yeah.
tough because when for instance, if I asked you, how much German do you know? It's like, how can you answer that
Yeah.
question? It's like, some, quite a lot, quite a bit. The point is that language is such a dynamic skill and ability. And by the way, you forget things all the time too. Even in your
Mm.
native language, you forget words, you forget common idioms or whatever, and so there's also atrophy going on all the time. And
Yeah. Yeah.
so for me, it's incredibly difficult to say how much I know, but what I do know is that the things that I can do now that I couldn't do, let's say, for instance, Russian is an example I often give because I'm not
Mm.
very good at Russian after, let's say, 2 years of sort of lazy and not very focused, occasional huge breaks study. That's the preface I always use. um, but the point is, could I read even the alphabet 2 years ago? No.
Mm.
Can I go on to BBC Russian now and get the gist of an article without understanding every single word? Yes. I mean, that's incredible. Just saying it, I'm like, how is this? How are more people not doing this? Because it's so incredible that you can just spend a little bit of time. I probably spent less than 200 hours learning Russian over the last 2 years,
Mm.
and I can read and I can understand basic conversation. I can talk to people. I can read signs and menus. I can, watch TV. Not understand everything, but probably follow along and not get completely bored because you don't understand anything. So
Yeah.
that's the
Yeah.
comparison I like to do. Not like, oh, I know 15% of the Russian language now. If that was even possible to quantify, but there's a lot of biases going on here. The brain probably doesn't even know how much it knows because many of the words are in passive memory. So
Mm.
if you ask me a word, I could probably I could probably tell you what it means, but I might not be able to actually produce it myself initially.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a really gray area.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you gave examples of things you can do rather than saying I'm at this level,
Yeah,
A1 or B1 or whatever. Um, and I think a lot of language learners tend to use the European framework levels, although that's not as meaningful as being able to say I can read the Russian alphabet,
yeah,
or I can do this and that. So I think that's one tip I would give to anyone who's learning a language would be evaluate and actually say to yourself, what is it that you can do now compared to 2 months ago? And what is it that you thought you would be able to do, but you can't still? And
right.
that's your starting point for the next stage of your journey.
Focus on practicality. I think it's a great tip, and don't focus on
Yeah.
some arbitrary and useless levels designed by some academic somewhere. Because the thing about those levels is that yeah, it's good to compare with, and I don't mind people using it to estimate their language skills, but from a personal point of view, it doesn't mean anything that I'm B1 in German or B2 or whatever. It doesn't mean anything. You might as well say that
Hmm.
you're you know, you, you might as well insert any random word to explain your skills because those frameworks are so based on tests where you have to get there are I think there's what 3 or 4 different elements to the test, the spoken, written,
Hmm.
the different elements. And so if you're the best at reading Russian ever, like if you really love Russian literature and you taught yourself how to read Russian, you could go in and get a super top mark for reading, and then when you
Hmm.
had to speak you'd get a 0 because you've never spoken the language before, because you
Yeah.
never you never wanted to, you never needed to. And then, oh well, you're A1. Well, no.
Hmm.
Well, you might
Yeah.
be officially, but you've achieved so much more depending on what you want to do. And I see, for instance, I mean, now we talked about Benny Lewis a lot. I don't think he worked a lot on the reading and writing, so he would probably test a lot lower than his actual speaking ability, which was his focus, because he didn't focus on those other things, because they were not a priority for him.
Yeah. 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 I think it's interesting because I'm like you. I don't mind people kind of using those levels necessarily, but what does it actually mean when you say you want to get? And a lot of people kind of they want a tutor, and they want to do Skype tuition, and they want to get to this level. Um, but it's not, I think, even for yourself internally, how helpful is this for you? How accomplished will you feel at the end of the process? I think what helps me personally is to have some very specific things I want to be able to do. So when I started learning Japanese, for example, I said to myself, I want to be able to say what my name is, ask other people what their name is, say where I live, ask people where they live,
Hmm.
and I want to be able to, say things in a restaurant because I knew I'd need that. So, hello, goodbye, thank you, can I have this? And these were the very kind of specific, tangible things. And then I could go and try to use those phrases and then evaluate my progress based on that. Have I been able to ask for a dish in a restaurant? Um, do I know how to introduce myself?
Yeah.
And then I think in terms of checking your progress by yourself, that's even more satisfying because you don't have to go to anyone and say, "Can you test me?" Um,
Or
so
pay for it.
yeah, exactly.
Those tests are not cheap.
Mm,
I don't even know what they cost, but I mean, if they cost £100, I wouldn't be surprised. Like the official, Goethe or Institut Français or whatever, whoever
yeah,
tests. They're
yeah,
quite
yeah.
pricey for. Well, I guess career-wise, some people might need it, and some people do it as a hobby anyway. But still, it's an interesting topic because people like to throw these levels around, and I hear many people when they start learning a language, they're like, I want to get to C2. And I'm like, that's interesting because that's very high. And, when I went to the Polyglot workshops, one of the first things we did was talk about the levels, with Richard and Alex.
Yeah.
And one of the first things we talked about was like, how long does it take to get to A1? And some people, and a lot of people I've heard this from later, were like, oh, I can do that in a weekend or a week or. And it's like when we read out the requirements and Richard and Alex gave their thoughts based on actual tests, they were like, this is months. This is like, this is a few months of well, maybe 1 month, I think they said, of not full-time study. And then A2, and then it scales exponentially. So getting to C2 would be years and years.
Yeah.
Maybe never really.
Yeah.
And that's not to discourage anyone. I would just like say, what is it you think you can't do at C1 that you could do with C2? And it's probably such a tiny area. It's probably mostly due to cultural and idiomatic references. But again, if English native speakers don't know all the English idioms or words, there's like, I don't know how many words there are in the English language. I see a lot of numbers getting thrown around, but if we say 250,000, there's no way that anyone could know all of them. So essentially you're never completely done with it, as you mentioned before. But it's funny, we have there's a distinction between C2 and native speaker.
Yeah.
It's assumed that the native speaker
Yeah.
knows more than the C2, which is, I don't think that's always true.
No, it's not always true. I think I mean I've lived outside of Poland for a number of years now, but and I work in English. I use English every day. So if you gave me a Polish speaker who's at that level, I bet they could they would maybe know some vocabulary that I'm not familiar with.
Right.
Who knows? Or they would be able to use it better.
Yeah, they know the
Um,
grammar, how it works in more detail, whereas you probably just know it instinctively.
yeah, yeah. And I think the kind of what you mentioned about some people kind of aiming for very, very high from the start, I think the danger of that is that you very easily get overwhelmed
Yeah.
and you are not specific enough to actually be able to move forward. Because if I start to learn a new language, say I want to learn Russian, and this is my goal, to be fluent in Russian, but I haven't actually asked myself, what does it mean? What's the step in between? And I think that's what you were talking about earlier, which is the kind of gap between, where we are and where we want to be,
Yeah.
and we don't really know what's in between.
Right.
So I think that's maybe the reason why some people get put off.
Yeah, or quit, give up.
Yeah, yeah,
It's really tough, isn't it? Our brains are really experts at self-sabotage.
yeah, absolutely.
Burning out is a real thing too. I remember last year I did an experiment on how many Russian words I could learn in, I think it was like a month and a half, maybe 2 months. And I really went
Mm.
all in on memorize, and I did like 50, 70 words a day, which is just ridiculous. And
That's not
after,
bad.
no, that's ridiculous, basically. And I think I got up to about 1,000 words in a month. And then I just quit. And I was just like, this is not worth it. I mean, it was like hours a day. I think it was something like I had to do an hour and a half just to refresh, and then it would take another hour to add that day's words.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
then you might say, well, okay, well you burn out a little bit. You'll get back on it after a break. I basically
Mm.
quit flashcards after that. I haven't done flashcards in, like, I just started, I think, about a week ago on Memrise again because it works so well for me. Actually, I retain words so well with Memrise, and well, I could have used Anki as well, but that's my favorite. I retain vocabulary so well with flashcards that it's a shame that I didn't use it. But I burned out completely, and it's taking me a year and a half to to get back to. So I mean,
Oh,
really,
wow.
it's not just if you burn out, it's gonna you can take a little week off and then you can get back to it. You probably could though, but just I didn't feel like it. I was like, oh, not flashcards again. So it's a true
Yeah.
word of warning.
Yeah. It's interesting. I read this article the other day, and it was talking about why motivation is not essential when whatever it is that you're trying to do. And basically, I think the main point was that we don't we don't stop doing something because we lose motivation. We stop doing something because we don't really know why we're doing it. So we don't really understand the real reason behind it. So the example that was given was something to do with sort of sport and fitness and I don't know, losing weight or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And so somebody said, well, why are you trying to exercise regularly? And the answer was, well, because I want to lose weight. And then the point was that this wasn't the real reason why somebody wanted to exercise. So then when you go kind of deeper down, you realize that the real reason might be, I want to feel healthy because when I climb up the stairs to get to my apartment, I'm out of breath. And then I'm tired, and then I can't really do anything because I feel, tired
Yeah.
and exhausted, whatever. And really, what I want to do is I want to go out and play with my children outside or whatever. So I think that, the real reason is that I want to spend more time with my children.
Right.
So again, it's this idea of kind of getting to the bottom of the issue and really asking yourself, why is it that you're trying to learn the language that you're trying to learn?
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't answer that, if you're just memorizing, like you said, memorizing, hundreds and hundreds of words, what's the point? I mean, some people are motivated by that. I admit that, some people are motivated by pure numbers and by the fact that they can memorize a certain amount of vocabulary. But for other learners, that's not enough to maintain motivation.
Right.
You have to know exactly why it is that you're doing it.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's kind of annoying sometimes because some people might want to do something without having these great reasons, but you still might want to do it. It's kind of like, I mean, I suppose you could always find good reasons for losing weight or getting fit, but unless you actually believe in it, then it doesn't really give you that extra motivation that we need sometimes. And I think what I'm beginning to understand also is that motivation is good, but at the end of the day, you also need to kind of just do it. It's kind of the
Mm.
Nike slogan. I think if you said that you needed motivation to do anything, then I don't think a lot would get done.
Mm-hmm.
Like work, for instance, people do work even though, well, I guess the money is motivation enough. But my point is just that, yeah, it's tougher, but I think sometimes you just have to do it. Like even if you don't
Mm.
find it fun or interesting, if you want to do it, even though your motivation is not fully there, just do it. Do I enjoy doing flashcards endlessly?
Mm.
No, not really. But they work, and that's the point. And then some person said to me recently. He said, "Well, you should only do things that you enjoy." I find that kind of. I mean, that's very ambitious, isn't it? Or is that just me and my cynical worldview, where things that are worth doing will always be hard, or I
Yeah.
don't know. What do you think about that?
I think it's a good idea, just doing what you enjoy. But I think I agree with you that, sometimes to move things forward, you have to do the thing that you fear the most and the thing that you actually don't want to do the most. I
Right.
think I got it from some book. I can't remember where I got it from, but I think it's very true, and I think it's true with language learning. When you come up against an obstacle, it's often an obstacle that makes you feel uncomfortable in some way,
Right.
either because you don't understand the topic or because you feel shy about speaking. And, if this is your blocker, then you need to get things done. And, even if you're not motivated. So I think there's a difference between, or not a difference, but I think these are two sides of the same coin, motivation and commitment.
Hmm.
And they're completely different things. As we said, motivation is something that is driving you forward, whereas commitment is almost like a contract that you sign with yourself, and you say, um, I'm motivated to learn French, but really what I'm doing is I'm committing my time. Like we said, do 5 minutes, and you might end up doing an hour, but you need to commit to those 5 minutes to get to the hour. Um, so, and I think when you really are serious about making that commitment, then the motivation comes after, almost.
Oh yeah.
Being able to see your progress and enjoying the process of learning a language, being able to speak to people
Meeting
and
new
read and
people.
understand,
Yeah.
and yeah, and it gives you, real energy. And I think that's where the motivation comes from, at least for me. But at the same time, I want to just acknowledge the point that you made about learning something without necessarily having reasons. And I think that's also great. Yeah,
Yeah.
I wasn't trying to say that, you have to necessarily have a reason. And I think when
Well,
I
some
went to the,
people do that. Some people say that if you don't have the proper motivation, you should find something else.
yeah, yeah. But I think I'm thinking more about, when people learn languages and you ask them why, and they just say, just because,
Right.
because I just like the language. I don't have to give you a reason why I'm learning Slovak or whatever, because I just want to do it. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, it's true. It's quite funny that you see that a lot in the community. Like, why did you learn Moroccan Arabic? Well, oh, I didn't really have anything to do. Slow summer.
Yeah,
Kind of funny.
yeah,
So I
absolutely.
think that's cool. Just getting knowledge for the sake of knowledge. I think is quite cool.
Yeah.
But I mean, we could talk about motivation and these things all day. But I just wanted to move into a different topic. In the introduction, I said you were a language coach. And I just wanted to get sort of your words on what a language coach is and what does it mean?
Um, right. So I think this is the kind of it's a kind of phrase, I suppose, that I use to describe what I do with all the kind of language work that I do. So I would say that, you know, I mean, coaching is not strictly that, but I think the blogging work I do and the webinars I've recently started doing, and all the kind of the outreach work I suppose I do, is about coaching, really. That's how I see it. I also do some coaching with people sort of individually,
Hmm.
just advising them on learning languages.
Is that based on
And
general learning or are you coaching with the language in mind?
no, so this is more general.
Hmm.
And I think coaching is basically about helping somebody find the way through the learning process. I think that's essentially what it's about. So it's providing advice on how to overcome obstacles, how to structure your learning so that you're making progress, how to set goals. So I think it's basically solving problems.
Hmm.
And I think you can, for anyone who is struggling with making progress. So I think you can do it in many different ways. And I think, even blogging is a form of coaching in that respect, because you're providing people with ideas
Sure.
that they can use to solve their language problems. So I'm not thinking about specific language problems, like, I don't know how to say this in German, but more kind of fundamental problems relating to the learning process.
Right. Well, I agree. I think that producing any kind of content helpful to language learners would be a form of coaching. And I like that there are a lot of coaches out there who can share ideas and try and spread the love of and I guess the belief. Everything starts with the belief that you can actually do it. You know, if you didn't believe that you could learn French on your own, then you'll never do it because that just becomes a self fulfilling prophecy, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So
absolutely.
so the more people who make YouTube videos or podcasts or blogs, and I've seen some great new bloggers lately, read some great articles, and the more the better. And I always like to use the TED slogan, ideas worth sharing, and I think this is totally true, and that's cool. That's cool. And you also recently produced a course with your. Is that sort of your language learning coaching wisdom in one unit?
Yeah, I think that's a good description of that. So yeah, it's a course which is basically about how I learn languages or how to learn languages effectively. And it's focused on precisely that, building habits, managing your time so that you can fit language learning around your schedule, setting goals, and then specific strategies for learning vocabulary, improving your reading, writing, speaking. So kind of some more kind of practical, actionable tips there as well. Um,
So a little bit of
yeah,
everything.
and it's a little bit of everything, and it's based on the kind of idea that, you can learn even if you're busy. And the real key to success, I think, in my experience, is finding a way that works for you, um, by using some very simple strategies, around goal setting or kind of forming productive habits that will support your learning. Because that's the stumbling block that I've seen time and time again when talking to my friends, when talking to people I've worked with, in the kind of language world, uh, is that they're stuck at one level and they just don't know what to do to progress.
Right.
Um, I was just talking to a friend the other day who's really kind of always having the same conversation with me. I'm getting through the same resource, the same book all the time, and I just always, every time, I feel like I'm learning it again from scratch.
Hmm.
So he's not making any progress because of that, because he's kind of stuck at a certain level and he can't move on. So I think it's a common problem, and I think that's specifically the problem that I'm trying to address in Language Learner Pro, which is the course.
Awesome. And I'll link that up, actualfluency.com/LLP. Why not? That's easy to remember.
Oh,
So
thank you.
people can go directly.
Thank you.
And what kind of challenges do you have when you want to create a course that helps people to learn every language in the world? And what kind of, when you're going through it, it must have been tough to go back to remember how you used to struggle with it, or how you used to think years ago, or did you have to rely on other people's experiences, to the people who you were helping, you were coaching? Did you kind of include their problems and try to solve them, or how did you actually go about creating it?
Yeah, I think the important thing to recognize is that everyone is different, and there is no single right way to learn a language. And I think we probably both agree
Sure.
on that. Um, so everyone is different, and obviously everyone has different challenges. So when I was learning the languages that I've attempted to learn in my life, every time I came up against a different obstacle. The most recent language I've been learning is Japanese, and that's a completely
Right.
new journey for me. It's a very different. It's probably my favorite language, actually, And I think it's precisely because there are so many different problems. And I think that gives me a bit of inspiration in terms of, what could be the problems that other learners might be
Hmm.
encountering when learning this language. So I think I when I created the course, I tried to start from the problems, and then think of solutions to those problems rather than, um, you know, starting with the solutions. So, for example, in the section, there's a part of the course where I talk about learning vocabulary effectively. Um, One of the kind of issues that I've identified that I'm sure a lot of people listening to this will be able to relate to is, how do you make sure that you don't just understand the vocabulary that you know, but how can you make sure that you actually use it? Because I think a lot of people have this problem where they're reading something and it's all brilliant, and they're reading a novel and it's using all this beautiful language and you can understand everything, but then when somebody asks you what was that novel about, you will explain it to them in very simple language, and you will feel angry with yourself that you're not able to use the beautiful phrases that you've just read in the book. Have you had a similar experience before?
Well, well, that's almost a trick question, isn't it? Because I can't talk about the things that I don't know I know. If it
Oh,
makes
I
sense, like
see. Okay, yeah.
the problem is what you're talking about is the difference between active and passive memory, or maybe even just
Yeah.
between knowing something and not knowing something. But so I, if I wanted to, well, I've certainly had experiences where I've said I used to know this word,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
now I don't. Like if you're testing a flashcard or something and it says whatever tree, and I'm like, "Ugh, I swear I used to know how to say this. But yeah, the other thing, it's I guess it's going back to putting unreasonable expectations on our own shoulders. Is that we want to sound like I don't know, Shakespeare. Well, I guess that's a little bit outdated, but we're trying to sound like really high level speakers of the language when we only just went through chapter one of the book.
Yeah.
Whereas
Yeah.
if we just kind of embraced it and said, I'm terrible at this language right now, so I'll speak terribly. I mean that makes sense, and but I will
Mm.
speak some. Like Benny Lewis calls it the Tarzan method.
Mm.
Me hungry, me want pizza or whatever.
Yeah.
That works. That works really great. But I think what you're describing before it would for me signal some kind of cognitive dissonance between your expectations and your actual skill level. Where so
Yeah. Yeah. But I think it's a problem that, we can attempt to address,
for sure.
as part of the learning process. And I think, one of the ways of addressing it is really incorporating practice. So, once into learning, so making passive learning into active learning by, making sure that when you learn a word, you don't just learn a word, you learn a sentence, for
Right.
example, and you know how to use it straight away, and then you say it.
That's a good tip.
um,
Yeah.
so I think it's strategies like that that help us, turn learning into a more of a sort of active activity. Uh, but yeah, of course, there's always this dissonance that, I think we can't perhaps eliminate it completely, but we can aim to improve it as much as we can.
Yeah, it's tough to it's tough to put your pride on the chopping block, but sometimes you just have to do it and just just guess, and
Yeah,
sometimes you won't be understood, but hey, you tried, and then you'll probably be corrected, and you'll learn from it instead of just
yeah,
waiting until you have it, completely perfect. And even then, I think there's also a dissonance because, I would try and, for instance, when I was speaking with my tutor in Russian, I would not say sentences until I believe they were true. But that's kind of a
yeah,
grand statement for somebody who's been learning Russian for 7 months to be able to actually verify if the sentence is true
yeah,
or not. So the sentences were correct to a point. They were maybe more correct than when I started thinking about it, but still, it's completely ridiculous to believe that you're not going to make mistakes just because you don't speak anything. You eliminate 95% of your speech just because you can speak 5% that's close to correct, but you don't know if it's correct because you have no ability. It's
Yeah,
funny.
yeah. I think it's I read it somewhere. I think it's Mark Zuckerberg. His kind of motto for his employees at Facebook is, done is better than perfect, and that's how he grew his
Right.
empire.
Well, that you can
Uh,
use that for anything.
yeah,
You
yeah,
just have to ship something, and sometimes that's just a sentence or a phrase or whatever. Sometimes it
yeah,
doesn't work. Sometimes you look like an idiot, but guess what? It's all part of the growing process. If we had memories of how many times we sounded like idiots when we were kids, that
yeah,
when kids learn a language, they don't instantly speak grammatically correct. They develop a sense of grammar slowly.
yeah.
They don't understand the difference between the persons in English, for instance. They don't understand
Mm,
that. They don't understand the tenses. So
hmm.
they build on it, but it doesn't stop them from actually just shouting. Me
Yeah,
want
sure.
food, meat want food. They if they can say that, you'll bet they'll shout it all the time.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. And
So
I think going back to your question about coaching, I think one of the objectives of coaching is precisely to allow people to get out of this kind of mentality of I have to have everything perfect,
hmm,
because that's probably one of the main blockers.
I'm sure
I've
it
got a
is.
blog post coming up on that in a few days, so
Sweet. Well,
uh,
in the future.
yeah, it's a really interesting topic, and I'm sure you've noticed that there are a lot of people out there who are kind of um, spreading the message of optimizing, perfecting everything, and making sure that you stick to your schedule 100% of the time. But really, this can be quite destructive for the learning process.
Oh yeah.
And yeah, and I think we should all remember that we won't get it right the first time. Sometimes we will, sometimes we won't, and that's okay. And you don't have to be perfect, because whatever you're doing is good. And then, it can only get better.
Exactly, and what what a sentiment to finish this episode on. I really, I probably said this before in previous episodes to the listeners out there that I really like to discuss kind of the basics of language learning because I think sometimes they get overlooked, and sometimes people say, well, do I need to wait 3.7 hours between renewing flashcards, or do I need to wait 4.2? And I'm like, just do the damn flashcards. Don't worry about it. So for me, it's really nice to bring it back to the basics and just kind of talk about these basic human fallacies, these basic
Yeah.
psychological um, flaws, basically that we all have, and build on them to fluency. So thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story and your coaching wisdom and language learning wisdom. I definitely agree with, I believe, almost everything you've said. So we're definitely on the same page in terms of language learning. And if people
Um,
want to find out more about you, can you just give a few of your locations they can check out?
yeah, so if you'd like to read the blog, it's fiveminute so it's digit five, fiveminute and you can also find me on Facebook, just by searching 5 Minute Language. It should come up. I'm on Twitter as well, but I don't want to kind of spread myself too thin. So let's just stick to those two locations.
All right,
But
fantastic.
yeah, thank you very much for having me on the podcast, Chris, and it's been really great talking to you.
Very welcome. Very, anytime, and it's good to see you in around the world as well, and whenever the opportunity comes up.
Yeah, hopefully, hopefully.
All right. Well, have a great evening and see you around.
Yeah, thank you very much. And you too.
Cheers.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye. Thank you so much for listening to the Actual Fluency podcast. If you want to come onto the podcast and share your language learning story, don't hesitate to apply on actualfluency.com/guest. See you in the next one.